Summer 1912. Southern Louisiana, warm air, the heavy smell of swamps, the whisper of reeds. The Dunbar family stops at Lake Suisi, a place where the water comes right up to the shore, and all living things seem to hide beneath the green skin of the lagoon. At some point, no one could say exactly when, 4-year-old Bobby disappears. No cry, no splash, no trace. Only emptiness on the shore, and fear that, like the tide, slowly engulfs the entire district. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel and click on the bell. We have many unsolved cases where the truth has been hidden in plain sight for decades. Write in the comments which city you are listening from and whether you knew anything about the Bobby Dunbar case before this story. Now, on to the events. At dawn the next day, the lakeshore was black with people. Neighbors, hunters, fishermen, men with poles, women with kerosene lamps. They searched for the boy among the roots of cypress trees, in the coastal thickets, in the mud, where there were footprints of birds and foxes, but not of a child. They combed the water with rakes and broke up dense islands of water lilies. Boats were brought out onto the lake. Dogs were brought in. Days passed, and with each passing day, hope receded a little more. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Boy from Opelousas missing. Snake? Alligator? Kidnapping? The Dunbar family, Percy and Leslie, prayed, made promises, offered rewards. One of the largest search operations in the history of Louisiana at that time began. The search dragged on for weeks, then months. And, as often happens in such situations, one theory followed another. Some people thought they had seen the boy on the road. Others said they had heard crying at the pier. Nothing was certain. 8 months have passed. In the spring of 1913, a short notice appeared in a newspaper column next to an advertisement for mules for sale. A man, a traveling piano and organ tuner, had been spotted in Mississippi traveling with a boy who resembled the missing Bobby. The man's name was William Cantwell Walters. He claimed that the boy was Bruce, the son of a woman he knew whom he was helping. The police detained Walters in a small town. They sat the boy down on a chair, looked at him closely, and, as often happens when hope desperately seeks confirmation, saw familiar features. Percy and Leslie Dunbar hurried to where the authorities were holding the child. This story is complicated and painful. Newspapers at the time reported that the identification was accompanied by dramatic scenes. Apparently, at first, Leslie was confused. The child had grown, tanned, and spoke differently. Then he was washed, and his mother supposedly recognized his birthmarks: a scar on his foot from a burn, moles on his neck and thigh. It is difficult to say today how accurate these details are. But the fact is, the Dunbar family declared that this was their son. The child went to Louisiana as Bobby Dunbar found. And this is where the second strand of this story begins, the one that transforms it from a tragedy into a mystery that spans the entire 20th century. A woman named Julia Anderson appeared on the horizon. Poor, lonely, tired. She said, "The boy's name is Bruce. He is my son. And I did indeed allow William Walters to take him away for a while so that I could find a job." She was not married, she lived a difficult life, and in the society of those years, that mattered greatly. People looked at her with disapproval. Bad mother. And yet she came, stood in front of the people who were already celebrating Bobby's return, and said, "Give me back my child." Her words were drowned out by the noise. There were identifications, misunderstandings, rumors. At the first meeting, as reported by some publications, Julia was allegedly not allowed to see the boy freely. Either he was dressed or he was brought out among other children, and she could not immediately say with certainty, "This is mine." Later, when she saw his birthmarks, she said, "Yes, this is Bruce." But public opinion had already taken sides. The newspapers portrayed Julia as immoral and Walters as a kidnapper. William Cantwell Walters insisted that there had been no kidnapping. He said that Julia herself had handed the boy over to him. He did not change his testimony, even when his accusation became a convenient explanation for someone else's pain. He was tried in Louisiana on kidnapping charges. The prosecutor painted a picture of a malicious deceiver who traveled across the states with someone else's son and traded on someone else's grief. The sentence was harsh. According to modern accounts, Walters was found guilty. He spent about 2 years in prison. Then the verdict was challenged, and at the retrial, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision, and the case was eventually closed. William was released with the label of kidnapper, and with the same statement on his lips, "I didn't kidnap anyone. The boy was Bruce Anderson." Meanwhile, the boy grew up in the Dunbar household, just like Bobby. He went to school, then got married, and became a father. Adult life smoothed out the rough edges of his childhood drama. In his hometown, he was welcomed as a symbol of a miraculous return. He died in the mid-1960s, leaving behind children and grandchildren who bore the Dunbar surname. It would seem that the story is closed, but the truth is a long-lasting thing. It can lie quietly for decades and then suddenly knock on the door. Almost a century later, the granddaughter of that very same returned Bobby, Margaret Dunbar Catchwright, began her own investigation. The family legend haunted her, and there were too many inconsistencies in the archives. She leafed through old clippings, dug up court records, and found letters that people had written to each other in the 1910s. And it became even stranger how easily society turned away from Julia Anderson and believed in the miracle it so desperately wanted to believe in. In the early 2000s, when genetic testing became more accessible, the family faced a question that could only be answered by science. Was the man who grew up as Bobby Dunbar related to the Dunbars on his father's side? The DNA of Bobby's descendants was compared with that of a close relative from the line of his presumed grandfather, his father's brother. The result was uncompromising. There was no match. This meant only one thing. The boy who was returned in 1913 was not the biological son of Percy Dunbar. Later, the results were compared with Julia Anderson's descendants. The match was confirmed. The truth, which had been kept silent for almost 100 years, was finally spoken aloud. The boy, who was named Bobby Dunbar, was, in all likelihood, Bruce Anderson, the son of that very poor, lonely woman whose words were drowned out by a chorus of accusations. Let's rewind and slowly go through this path again, through the details that hide the answer to the question, how did this become possible? Scene 1. Lake Suwaisi. This is not a resort, not a well-trodden beach. It is a southern swamp with dark water, tree roots clinging to the edge of the land, and wildlife that pays no attention to humans. Children were always supervised there, but as soon as an adult turned away, the child was already at the shore, with reeds taller than their head and one step to the side, and you lost sight of them. In those days, locals told stories about snakes and death backwaters where the water sucked at your feet. They searched everywhere for Bobby. They killed alligators and cut them open, a terrible, medieval, desperate attempt to find at least some sign. Nothing. and slowly the tragedy became background noise, like a constant hum. The town learned to move on, but his parents did not. And when news came from another state about a boy who looked like their son, they heard not doubt, but salvation. Scene 2. Walter's arrest. A small station, a dusty road, 2 or 3 police officers, curious people around. A man stands with his tools, a boy next to him, looking up at everyone, not frightened, but rather tired of the attention. Walters says, "This is Bruce, we're going to his mother's." The police officers say, "A boy has gone missing in Louisiana. We need to figure this out." The boy is taken away. The newspapers are already printing the sensational news, "Found." Walters becomes a negative character in the pages where simple roles are favored: villain, victim, savior. Scene 3. Identification. How much of this was truth? How much was hope? And how much was pressure? The documents are contradictory, but there is a common thread: tension, tears, suspicions, details of skin and ear shape, which at such moments determine people's fates. If you have ever seen people recognize someone they have lost after months of separation, you know that memory is like a spring. It adapts to desire. In 1913, there were no DNA tests. There was only "I feel" and "I believe," and the city waited for a miracle. Scene 4. Julia Anderson. She arrived later, and she came alone. The authorities and the press of that time rarely believed such women. She was forced to justify her poverty and the fact that she had let her son go with a man she trusted. For many, this was already proof of her incompetence. But if we put aside our prejudices, what remains is a simple story: a mother who temporarily left her child in the care of an acquaintance in order to find work, a practice that was not uncommon in those days. Even today, it does not seem implausible. The first identification yielded inconclusive results. That happens. But the key detail is that Julia did not give up. She said again and again, "This is my son." She remained in a city where she was not welcome. She wrote letters to the editor. She stood in court, where she had neither money nor lawyers of comparable weight, and repeated the same thing over and over again. Only the public ear was tuned to a different channel at that moment. Scene 5. The Trial of Walters. The trial in Louisiana was cathartic for those who needed to name the guilty party. Kidnapping was the word that closed the case. Walters stood his ground. He did not change his story. And yet the jury found him guilty. He was sent to prison. Then came the appeal, procedural twists and turns, and, after about 2 years, freedom. But his reputation was already ruined, and his life was over. Scene 6. The Further Life of Bobby Dunbar. He grew up in a family where he was loved, perhaps sincerely, with all their hearts, trying to forget their doubts. He was a husband and father, drove a car, worked, laughed, and took photos. The son who was returned. His children heard the story of how their father was found, a story with heroes and villains, and this legend made their sense of family belonging particularly vivid. And that is precisely why it was so painful and frightening for his descendants to verify the legend using scientific methods. Scene 7. DNA, 2004. The test knows nothing of love, memory, or newspaper headlines. It knows only sequences. And when the sequences did not match, the illusions had to be let go. The Dunbar family, already a new generation, was confronted with a truth that did not negate love, but changed names. Those who call themselves conscientious researchers of the past did the right thing. They accepted the results. And that means they also accepted the tragedy of a woman who, in every sense, lost in 1913. What about the real Bobby Dunbar? Unfortunately, there are no answers to this question. The theory that he drowned in Lake Susie remains plausible. No evidence has been found to suggest that he lived somewhere under a different name. There are gaps in the story where it remains silent. And yet, looking at this case from a distance, you realize that this story is not just about a boy. It is a story about us. It's about how society chooses convenient explanations, how courts make decisions in the shadow of moral prejudices, how the press can replace doubt with certainty, and it's about how science, without fanfare, can, 100 years later, put an end to something that people themselves did not dare to end. A few questions that inevitably arise. Why did the Dunbar family accept the identification so confidently? The answer is more complicated than they wanted to believe it. In the absence of solid evidence, under the pressure of public attention, with physical clues in the form of scars and moles that can be found on almost anyone, and with the support of the local press, the likelihood of cognitive error was high. When the whole town tells you, "Here he is, your son," it is inhumanly difficult to doubt it. Why was Walters convicted? Because a villain was needed. His story contradicted public opinion, and therefore seemed false. Plus, there was the moral assessment. A respected family man versus a wandering craftsman and an unmarried mother. An equation, alas, familiar to many eras. Did the Dunbar family know the truth? There is no direct evidence. They probably made a choice, to live with the son they loved and not to reopen old wounds. This does not make them villains, but it shows the price that all participants in such stories pay. And finally, how should we view the memory of Bobby Bruce himself? He lived a life in which he did not choose his own name. He was a child who was divided between adults. He is not to blame. Perhaps he himself experienced inner turmoil. There is evidence that in adulthood, he would sometimes snap at questions about the past and ask people not to stir things up. Everyone decides for themselves what is tragedy, what is guilt, and what is a human attempt to move on with life. From that moment on, Bobby Dunbar's case became one of the central cases in the discussion about how dangerous it is to build criminal cases on public sentiment, and how important it is to maintain doubt where fairy tales are desired. In U.S. universities, it is studied in courses on criminology, journalism, and ethics. For us, it is a reminder. It is easy to make a mistake if you really want to be right. If this story caught your attention, share the video with someone who loves solving historical mysteries. Subscribe and like the video. This supports our work and helps algorithms show our content to those who will find it interesting. And in the comments, write whose version did you consider plausible before the DNA test? And how, in your opinion, should the courts and the press behave in situations where someone else's hopes are at stake? And finally, a small fork in the road for those who want more. We could do a separate issue on how Bobby's granddaughter, Margaret Dunbar Catchwright, pieced together the puzzle step by step. From Louisiana archives to letters in private collections, from the Walters trial transcripts to genetic procedures in the early 2000s, about how she talked to Julia Anderson's descendants, about the ethical issues raised by revisiting family history. If you're interested, let us know. In the next issue, we'll walk this path together. And now, a brief afterword. The Bobby Dunbar case is not about someone being bad. It is about human blindness, which feeds on fear and hope. About poverty, which is so easy to turn into an accusation. It is about the power of the scientific method, which does not distinguish between convenient and inconvenient truths. And it is about the importance of maintaining compassion for everyone who appears in these pages. For Julia, for the Dunbars, for the Walters, and, of course, for the boy who once disappeared by the water and was never found again. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories from the dark corners of our history. Take care of yourselves and your children.